Chris Lyttle to conclude and wind up the debate on the motion. Mr. Lyttle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I thank all the members for their contribution to this important debate and motion today. Mr. Deputy Speaker, can I start by acknowledging the victims and survivors of all child sexual abuse, and indeed in particular the victims and survivors that are present in this Assembly today, for the courage they show on a daily basis to continue to campaign on these important issues. The weighty responsibility that I feel to summarise the key elements of this debate are eased slightly by the united way in which this Assembly has called for the inclusion of Kincora Boys Home in the Westminster Child Sex Abuse Inquiry. It is indeed a scandal of national seriousness. There is clear agreement on that. It is also an indictment on the UK Government and this society that has taken over 40 years of pain and persistence to yet achieve full and proper disclosure of the full extent of the abuse suffered by children in our community at this home. My colleague Judith Cochrane, MLA, and I attended school yards from the location of this building, and we were prompted to propose this motion today by the work of our Alliance Party colleague and Member of Parliament for East Belfast, Naomi Long MP. Naomi Long has urged the Home Secretary, indeed the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, on several occasions now to include Kincora in the Westminster inquiry into child sex abuse. Many people have supported this call, and many people have worked tirelessly towards achieving this outcome for victims and survivors. I think of the many journalists that have been referenced in this Assembly today, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the organisations such as Amnesty International and many of the victims and survivors groups like Savia themselves who have worked on these issues. Mr. Deputy Speaker, at its heart, this is about systematic abuse of the most innocent members of our society by the people specifically charged and entrusted with their care, and adequately investigating the most serious allegations that security and intelligence services were deeply complicit in this abuse and indeed its concealment. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the gravity of these allegations mean that nothing less than the fullest independent investigation and disclosure of all available evidence will satisfy the right to justice for victims and survivors and the need to address the most serious disrepute that all those allegedly involved, including the state itself, have been brought by this litany of abuse. There is a clear opportunity now for the British Government, the Prime Minister, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and the Home Secretary to satisfy these demands by including Kincora Boys Home abuse in the UK inquiry chaired by Fiona Woolf, and to grant the military intelligence officers the clearance they need under the Official Secrets Act to present the grave allegations that they have made to this inquiry. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I understand, has suggested that it may be a matter for the devolved administrations to address child abuse. Well, this Executive and Assembly has certainly shown a degree of leadership and taken responsibility by enacting the historical institutional abuse judge-led public inquiry here in Northern Ireland. It has created opportunity for victims and survivors to present allegations, including those from Kincora Boys Home. And again, I would acknowledge the work of organisations like Savia, Amnesty International, and indeed previous members of this House, including Conall McDevitt, MLA, who worked tirelessly in order to support the progress towards achieving that inquiry. I would also pay tribute to Savia in the dedicated and dignified manner in which they have continued to campaign for adequate victim support for participants in this inquiry, and hope that they secure a soon update in relation to funding for a victim support centre that they are working to put in place in relation to this inquiry. They've also sought update in relation to any interim report or information that can be given on this inquiry. They've requested that work be started to explore potential compensation and indeed how non-institutional clerical child abuse may be addressed, which has been covered by a number of members here today. It's my understanding that OFM, DFM are conducting scoping studies in relation to these matters, and hopefully they will be able to provide us with an update on those important issues as well. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Chair of the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry has himself stated that he would not have the adequate powers to achieve full disclosure in relation to some of the most serious allegations into military intelligence involvement in Kincora. I think the contributions of members in this House today, in addition to that, have shown that the weight of argument and the support for inclusion of Kincora in the Westminster Child Sex Abuse Inquiry is increasingly irrefutable, and that the clamour for justice is now unavoidable. The Home Secretary must announce the inclusion of the Kincora Boys Home in the Westminster inquiry, and she must grant the exception from the Official Secrets Acts that the military intelligence officers need to provide the evidence necessary if we are to secure the level of investigation that victims and survivors deserve, and indeed that any democratic society must demand. Mr Deputy Speaker, it has been alluded to by other members today in their contributions. There were indeed many other children that were and are abused and terrorised in many other ways by non-state paramilitary organisations in our community, who hold themselves to far lower standards of human rights and who have provided far less disclosure of their abuse and terror. This Assembly is calling on the Home Secretary, as I hear it today, to ensure that this democratic society holds itself to much higher standards of accountability, justice, human rights, and the standards on which the very legitimacy of this society depends. This Assembly, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I hear it, is calling on the Home Secretary to ensure that she does not add to what has become known as a chronicle of lost opportunities in relation to the Kincora Boys Home, and to ensure that the principles that she set out for the Westminster inquiry, full investigation and prosecution and maximum transparency, are met by the inclusion and full investigation of all available evidence relating to Kincora Boys Home in this inquiry. Mr Deputy Speaker, I think this has been a unique debate today, with a clear, united message coming from this Assembly calling on the Home Secretary to take urgent action in relation to this issue. I would be grateful if the Speaker's office could ensure that there is communication sent to the Home Secretary to convey the mood of this House in relation to this serious and grave issue, and that we see action that we have called for today as soon as possible in relation to this important issue. Thank you.